Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Hotep. Welcome to IKG's Wisdom Wednesday, starting off our new year, 2023. We are so happy that you all have decided to join us this evening. We hope that you had a wonderful holiday and solstice season. And now we are here in 2023, kicking off our monthly lecture series. So welcome, welcome, and welcome. As always, we would first have to start off by just letting you all give us a chance to let us know who's here. So we do ask, as you're coming on in, feel free to type in the chat what city you are hailing from, and we will shout you out. So just want to start off by welcoming our family from Camp Springs, Maryland, of course, DC, Tampa, Florida, Kansas. Shout out to the Sankofa Leadership Academy, checking in from Patterson, New Jersey, Maryland, Georgia. We got Maryland holding it down tonight. So please keep your cities coming, your greetings coming on in. As always, just want to remind you a little bit about IKG, Wisdom Wednesday Lecture Series. We are a free lecture series held every third Wednesday of the month, and we've been holding it down via Zoom since 2020. Prior to that, we were having them in person here in Washington, D.C. This year, we still plan to keep them virtual, so please feel free to check out IKG's website, ikgculturalresourcecenter.com, where we will be posting the upcoming calendar by the end of this month. You will see who we have planned for you this year. We have some wonderful speakers planned. And we want to start off our year. We're happy to start off our year with our speaker this evening, Mr. Sam P.K. Collins. Mr. Sam Collins will be speaking on grassroots journalism as a vehicle for Pan-African self-determination. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Sam Collins is a grassroots journalist-educator and self-published author of Liberian descent who was born and raised in Washington, D.C. He works as a writer, editor, producer, researcher, and filmmaker, and has been influenced by his childhood and adolescence experiences in the nation's capital. Baba Sam is a graduate of the George Washington University and entered the journalism industry with stints at NBC Universal and National Public Radio. At American Urban Radio Networks, Baba Sam served as a White House press pool intern during President Barack Obama's second term. The majority of Baba Sam's journalism experience has been with the Black press, specifically the Washington Informer. Baba Sam has served as a reporter covering various facets of the local, national, and global Black African experience. These days, he primarily covers K-12 and college education with stories that highlight the perspectives of students, parents, and teachers. While at the Informer, Baba Sam launched All Eyes on DC, a grassroots media brand that hosted live news events at We Act Radio in Anacostia and Sankofa Video Books and Cafe here in Washington, D.C. Between 2015 and 2020, All Eyes on DC served as a platform for authentic Pan-African dialogue featuring well-known community figures. In 2016, that venture inspired Baba Sam to enter the education realm, where he has since served as an African-centered communications instructor. Tonight's program features Sam P. Collins with, tonight's program will be featuring, of course, Sam Collins, who will be sharing his experience and telling stories from an African-centered lens. As you listen and partake in this reasoning session, you will get an understanding of the current media landscape as articulated in the book, Babylon Be Still. You will also receive Brother Sam's prescription for producing and identifying accurate, high quality news stories. Sam states that in the United States, the media has often been defined as the fourth estate, designed as a tool to hold the three branches of government accountable. For African people, however, most media outlets don't produce news reflective of their identity as people living in a nation within a nation that's connected to the African diaspora. So please join me in welcoming Sam Collins as he delves more into this topic of grassroots journalism. And Brother Sam, thank you.
Peace and blessings. Many thanks, Sister Ajua, and many thanks to IKG for the platform and the opportunity. This has been a year in the making. When I first published Babylon Be Still, I made sure that I reached out to IKG as a platform, and it counted among one of the first platforms that we scheduled for an event of this magnitude. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to articulate what I consider to be um, a grassroots journalism manifesto, a manifesto of Pan African self determination as it's actualized through grassroots journalism. So, in going through this presentation, you'll get an idea of my professional and my spiritual journey, and you'll also learn about the tenets of grassroots journalism as defined by me. Before we begin, I highly encourage you to take in the information and be prepared to ask questions. I like answering questions and I like reasoning with people. This is not me talking at y'all. It is more so us engaging in discussion, digesting what was said, and then bouncing ideas off of one another. The objectives of this presentation, of course, we're looking at excerpts from Babylon Be Still to explore the current Black U.S. media landscape, to explore the concept of grassroots journalism, to explore how to infuse an African consciousness into one's reporting, and to look at the tools for the development that a reporter needs. And as you can see on the screen, we have the Kuji Chagalia sign, which means self-determination. Self-determination, the ability to define oneself and to manifest one's own destiny. That is the most important aspect of the Pan-African experience that should be actualized through journalism. Because as a journalist, you are always uh, you have a pulse on events, and it is up to you to provide an analysis that is of benefit to African people and an analysis that features African people. So about Babylon Be Still, as you can see, you have two different pictures of me. This picture of me was taken in 2012. I had graduated from undergrad and I was in grad school. At this point in my career, I was an intern at National Public Radio. So this was when I was just entering the journalism industry, and I had a consciousness that I was African living in America, but I still had not had the confidence to go about reporting the news and being unapologetic in my Africanity. Fast forward a decade or so later, you have me holding this book, Babylon Be Still, where I pretty much compiled older new essays about my experience. And in talking about my experience once again, I am calling on readers to embrace Pan African nationalism, also known as Universal African nationalism, as articulated by the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. So, in everything that I write, as it relates to Africa and as it relates to people, I am perpetuating the notion that we should be self determined in telling our stories. So, as promised, we're going to go through the current Black media landscape. So, these are the types of media that are consumed by Black people in the United States. This is not an exhaustive list. Of course, there are more examples, but you have one, two, three, four, five examples here. The first one being mainstream newspapers and news magazines that often hold up the ideology and the perspective of the Republican and Democratic parties. So NBC, Fox, and CNN are prime examples of that. Next, you have legacy Black press publications such as the Washington Informer, the Afro American newspaper, and the Chicago Defender. These newspapers were created as an antithesis for the mainstream publications, and they have direct connection with the Black community in their city. Next, you have entertainment news magazines, podcasts, and social media platforms that promote gossip. This type of news is quite popular on social media, and it is very popular among our young people. This is the type of news media that we have to counter as grassroots journalists, as it is lowering the vibration of our thought process. Next, we have independent media outlets with nationalist and socialist leanings, such as WPFW and Black Power Media. Highly recommend those if you are somebody who is looking for outlets that represent the authentic thinking within the community and thinking that is anti-establishment in a sense. I highly recommend those. Last but not least, we have investigative. We have two more actually. We have investigative news platforms, and then we have news outlets based in Africa and other parts of the world. As far as the news outlets based in Africa, we have to understand that Africa, some parts of Africa, more so than the United States, journalists are in danger. And as is often the case with neoliberalism, we have a form of black on black crime where the leaders who are put in power by a majority power structure, a global power structure, uh, pretty much put their foot on the necks of the media. Even so, you have outlets that are in favor of the presidency in that country, and you also have outlets that are on the margins that are telling the stories of the people. In Liberia, for example, you have a brother by the name of Henry P. Costa, who is often very critical of the presidential administration. Um, in the age of social media, these outlets, whether they're producing videos or they're producing news stories, have been proliferated even more. So, this is just a list of the different types of news that you will encounter daily. So, as far as examining the status quo, this is what I had to say about it on page 14 of Babylon Be Still. In several cases, when non-black reporters and black reporters lacking race consciousness assess conditions in the black community, they focus on the individual actions of the people living in those communities rather than the societal forces that created their environment. They often fall back on the notion that these men and women are in the situations they're in because of individual choices without looking at the situation with a wider societal lens. They also look at African people in the US as a national minority rather than part of a global indigenous majority. Furthermore, reporters lacking an African consciousness will never produce news content in solidarity with oppressed Black people in their city and around the world. So it's not that long of a quote. At the very same time, there are some things here that I want us to focus on. So, in the spirit of Ubuntu, we as African people are collective, meaning that the individual accomplishments and the actions of any particular African person are not indicative of African people, which is why in this day and age, we never should relish in the individual accomplishments of billionaires. At the very same time, when examining the social conditions of those of us who are living in the margins of society, any news outlet that does not provide context about why it is that people are in certain situations is not a reliable news source. We need news sources that provide a lot of context, not only historical, but social and cultural, meaning that we are not approaching it from a pathological lens where we're looking at African people as subhuman. On the other hand, we're doing quite the opposite as Pan African journalists. We are examining the conditions of African people in the context of their experiences and their relationship with this country, which has been pretty oppressive, more than oppressive, for the last 400 years or so. So, if a journalist is not covering it from that perspective, then they're not an effective journalist. An even more important point is that as a Pan African journalist, I never use the word minority when addressing or speaking about African people in the United States. As a matter of fact, if I do talk about Black people, I say Africans in America, I say people of African descent, and I capitalize the B in Black as a status of nationhood because as African people living in the United States, we are a nation within a nation. As a matter of fact, a shout out to the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa for forwarding this idea and keeping this idea alive over the last few decades. We have to look at ourselves as a nation within a nation, and we have to look at our newspapers and our media outlets as an extension of that nation. If you're not producing news content with that viewpoint, then that news content is the antithesis of what African people need to be self-determined. Because remember, self-determination is at the very foundation of what grassroots journalism perpetuates. So now that we got through the esoteric um, definition of grassroots journalism, and we got through what the status quo of the journalism industry is doing to the detriment of African people, it is time that we actually see what grassroots journalism looks like in action. So, grassroots journalism, once again, by definition, is an effort to center and mobilize the masses of African people through the contextualization of our unique individual experiences. So the key word here is contextualization. And like I said before, if you are examining the conditions of African people in isolation without examining the causes, the societal, cultural, economic, and whatsoever else causes of those conditions that African people are facing, then you are doing a disservice to them and you are perpetuating stereotypes that keep us mired in our dismal conditions, which is why the key word for a grassroots journalist is context. And this is the word that I want everybody who is listening to this presentation to keep in mind as we get through the rest of it. Once again, the key word is context, meaning that as the graphic here suggests, if you're looking at an individual person in the story, you have to get a sense of who they are, why they're going through what they're going through, where they are, who they are, how they are, and what is it that they're doing to get through this. The five W's and the H. Those are the key questions that will help us address context. And actually, these are the questions that further humanize people. Because when you humanize people, you provide context about their situation, you are better able to indict the forces that have kept our people mired in dismal conditions, and you are also able to prescribe solutions because people without a lack of knowledge are unable to address the conditions that they are facing, which is why it is important to not only have people authentic voices featured in your journalism, but to have the proper background information that explains the situation in the proper context. Once again, context being the proper word. So why grassroots journalism? I'm not going to read the whole quote, but this is on page, you'll find this somewhere between pages 13 and 15 in my book, Babylon Be Still. What I will do is read the red words. So when we're talking about the degree of accuracy in the African story, it depends on the writer's Pan-African consciousness. How aware is the writer about their Africanity? How aware are they about the fact that they are Africans living in America, regardless of whether their families came here on the airplane or their families came through the Ma'afa? How aware and how conscious are they of their Africanity? That's the first step in determining whether the story gets told accurately. Once again, or moving on rather, the next red part are these news articles and news content in general that the journalist is producing, do they represent the interests of Africans working to build a nation of their own? Just like I asked y'all to keep the word context in mind, I'm also requesting that we keep the word self-determination or Kuji Chagalia in mind. Okay, Kuji Chagalia, self-determination, nation building. Every article and piece of content that you produce as a grassroots journalist has to represent the interests of Africans working to build their own nation, working to establish their own businesses, working to solve their own problems. Otherwise, it is not authentic grassroots journalism. And in solving their own problems, they must have in depth knowledge about the sources of their collective dysfunction, and they must be exposed to credible voices on the front lines of global African nationhood. So, what we're talking about here is twofold, okay? Exposing people to credible voices and presenting them with contextual information that allows them to get on the right foot when it comes to nation building and actualizing Pan African self determination. Because once again, you need the proper knowledge about where we are and where we're trying to go as you're embarking on that mission. And journalists are just as important to the African nation as is any other person of other industries. Moving on. So once again, we're getting into the weeds of the craft. For those of y'all who have journalism background, I'm pretty sure you've seen the inverted pyramid time and time again. Before we get to it, we got to get through these 4 points here. So as a grassroots journalist, when you're writing a solid news story, you have to adopt an African-centered worldview. Once again, you got to conceptualize, right? So when you're writing about people and events, you got to make that African connection. Third point, you got to prioritize the voices of common everyday people over that of politicians, government officials, and other talking heads. So you got to prioritize regular people because, once again, we are a nation within a nation. And as people who are working towards self determination, we have to look at those who are in political power in this nation, that nation being the United States. We got to look at them as perpetuators of a system that is meant to hold us back. So you can't center them in your stories. In order to be grassroots, you have to be authentic to the cause by centering the voices of people who are in the trenches, authentic people with authentic experiences. And as you do that, once again, you provide the historical, cultural, and political context to further humanize them. Before we move on, two very important parts of the inverted pyramid that I have to point y'all to. The inverted pyramid is this right here, this whole structure. A little bit of history for y'all. Back in the day, way back in the day, before uh, laptops and fancy word processors, you had to cut and paste, literally cut, paste news articles onto a piece of paper, put it through a machine to produce the daily paper. In cases where the article was too long, the editor would cut the article from the bottom, meaning that the most important information had to be at the very top, which is why we call this part here the lead. The lead determines the focus of the story, which is why, as a grassroots journalist, you have to focus, you have to be very particular about which voice you put at the top. And the voice that you put at the top determines the direction of the story, the direction that you're trying to put the story in, which is why we call it the lead. The lead is the point that you're trying to make, and the opening quote is the voice of the main person in the article. Next part right here we have is the nut graph. The nut graph is the part that tells us why we should care. And the nut graph is the context, rather. It's not the conceptualization, it's the context. So after you tell the person's individual story, then you provide that context. You told us about their housing conditions, you told us about their health conditions, and then you let us know that what this person is going through is not uncommon, that there are more people going through it, and this is why. And then from that point, you provide more background information until you get to the end of the article and the closing quote. Now, in the interest of fairness, You can include politicians and government officials toward the bottom of the article. This is the part of the article where they have to explain themselves. Now that you've highlighted, right? Now that you've highlighted uh, the voice of the people and you've provided a reason for this situation, now you're given a chance for the politician to respond. It's not that you're necessarily holding them over the voice of the voiceless. It's that as a journalist, you got to be holistic in your investigative prowess, which is why you follow the inverted pyramid, which allows you to organize the article in a way where you remain credible and where it comes out well researched. Moving on. And in order to show y'all in action, I got a couple case studies for y'all. So the first case study is reporting on the U.S. Africa Leader Summit. Last month, between the 13th and the 15th, I produced 3 news pieces and 1 video about the U.S. Africa Leader Summit. So once again, you have an event. Depending on who you are and how you think, you're going to view the event in a certain way. And as you can see in this photo, I am here with my and former colleagues. That's me in the back on the same computer I'm talking to with you right now. I'm on this computer writing an article. And over the course of 3 days, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, I came into the summit eager to understand what was it that the United States government was trying to do in inviting 50 or so African leaders to Washington, D.C. Another question that was on my mind was, why was it that the African leaders, seeing as it was 50 or so of them and one United States government, why is it that they felt the need to come over here to talk about their continent? These are questions that were going through the mind of somebody with an African-centered Garveyite worldview. Had I not had that worldview, I would have stayed lockstep with what the establishment wanted me to report. That is why it is very essential, as I said earlier, to come into this game with with a pan-African consciousness. Pan-African meaning that I don't see myself as an American. I see myself as an African living in America, and I come into the and I come into the Terror Dome with uh, with the intention of writing for African people. So once I embraced that mindset, I collected data about what was happening on the continent. I collected data about Russia and China because that's exactly what it was about, countering Russia and China. I collected information about Afrikan because Afrikan has produced military bases all throughout the continent. And then after that, I interviewed people at the um, at the summit and people outside of the summit who were protesting, so I can get different perspectives. And given my affiliation with the Informer newspaper, I was also able to interview U.S. government officials. So the article was well rounded, but it centered the voices of people who were skeptical about the whole summit in the first place. So as you can see here, I got this video here for y'all. This is a video that I produced. It originally appeared on the Pan African Party podcast, and it also appeared on Shakara Speaks, which is based in the UK. Shout out to brother Shakara. He was very diligent about promoting this video. I produced this video on either the first or second day of the summit. Uh, we'll take a minute or two to watch it. Matter of fact, I need to make sure that the sound is on.
Peace and blessings, family. Peace and blessings. This is Brother Sam P.K. Collins. I am 1/4 of PAP-TV. Please forgive me for not being in the space today or over the last few weeks. It has been a busy time in my professional and personal life, but indeed, in the spirit of advancing our cause as universal African nationalists and as Pan-African minded people, I have carved time out to produce this recording about what it is that I have seen over the course of the last couple of days during what is called the US Africa Leaders Summit. For those who are not aware, the US Africa Leaders Summit has pretty much shut down a good portion of Washington, D.C., from the area where it's being held at the Washington Convention Center, including places, portions of Metro Center and Gallery Place. So it's very tight. There's a lot of security, and that's because there are 49 African heads of state and the African Union chair who are in Washington, D.C. to meet with members of the Biden administration to discuss what the administration described as fostering and strengthening relationships between Africa and the United States. Now, it's very clear. I don't have to tell you guys why that is not accurate and why there are more nefarious intentions in mind for what the United States has planned for the African continent. We don't have to look far in history or in the present time to understand that any relationship between the United States and Africa is a paternalistic one, one in which Africans have their resources seized, where they are given out loans with high interest rates that paralyze them from making advances in their infrastructure, and where the United States uses African countries as a battleground to advance global hegemony and to advance its cause against China and Russia, which is definitely what's happening right now. Because if you look at the summit in context, then you will see that it's coming after many of the African nations declined or just outright opposed sanctions against Russia in the aftermath of its invasion of Ukraine. And at a time when China pretty much forgave its debt-free or its interest-free loans to 17 African countries. So we're talking about a time of vast competition between these three entities, and we're talking about proxy wars that are being carried out. It is something that's reminiscent of the Cold War when the US and Russia was going at it. So the Biden administration, just like the Obama administration years before, saw it had no choice but to lighten this approach toward the African continent, because up until that time, it has been militaristic in nature in form of Afrikan, which has U.S. military bases throughout most of the continent, and even through the toppling of African leaders and the game of musical chairs that the United States plays with African nations in terms of just positioning leaders, neoliberal puppets that can carry out the will of the United States from Africa, where people are suffering because of US imposed policies. So all of this comes into play when we're talking about the US Africa Leader Summit. And the most dangerous aspect of this is how the United States plans to engage African leaders on the continent, young African leaders on the continent, and African youth throughout the diaspora. They have done so by co-opting Pan-African language and by co-opting a mission that was set forth by our ancestors in order to unite the African diaspora. The United States decided that they will take on that mission and co-opt it by using government resources and by using youth who look like me and you to carry out that mission. They are funding education initiatives.
I'll stop there. And this was a very important point that I wanted to bring up.
Let me know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I'll stop there because this is a very important point that I wanted to bring up in that presentation, and this goes back to what I said before when it comes to providing an analysis that counters that of the so-called mainstream media. The mainstream media has concocted a slogan called Africa Rising or Africa on the Rise. And they are using young Africans on the continent, as well as people of African descent or Africans all around the world. They are positioning them within the Biden administration and in seats of power around the world to take on an agenda that is of great detriment to African people in the trenches. So many years after independence, we have neocolonialism, and we have class wars, we have proxy wars that are being carried out by African people who look just like me and you. This is a very important aspect that the politically immature do not understand. So as grassroots journalists, it is incumbent that we provide that analysis. And as I will explain later on, you have to be multifaceted in how you do that, because in addition to writing, you have to also produce videos. A lot of our people, unfortunately, do not like reading these days. People have short attention spans when it comes to reading. I've seen it firsthand as an educator. So you have to produce videos that are short, succinct, and to the point, where people can get a grasp of what's going on and they can make their own decisions. But the true mark of a journalist, of a scholar, is somebody who can write clearly and somebody who can synthesize information so that it comes across as clearly as possible, and it shows, and it's pretty much a showcase of what they've been able to do in taking large loads of data to create an analysis. And we'll definitely get into that later. But this case study was very important to me because as a Pan-Africanist, as a universal African nationalist who attended the summit, I was very cognizant of what was happening, what was at hand. And, just like I saw as a press pool reporter during the Obama administration, they don't really let you in all the time in all the places. So I knew that from the very beginning. I just did what I had to do in terms of talking to real people and getting their perspective to put it out there. And I have to give the Washington Informer credit. I would not be able to do what I have done over the last 10 years or so if I had been at another outlet, say the Washington Post or the New York Times. It just would not have happened. The Black press, depending on where you are, is oftentimes very open to perspectives like mine because they understand and they know what it is. So we have to give them credit. Moving on. Hold on one second. So of the stories that I've written, period, during the summit, this one was about the AU chair calling for the lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe. And then once again, this one was about the youth summit, was about the leader summit and African youth. I want to focus on the Zimbabwe part really quickly. So once again, you have journalists of different perspectives who are in the same room, and depending on, your viewpoint, your worldview, you come out of that event with a different story. I waited and I waited. I was listening to the pomp and circumstance, the French, the English language, what they were saying. And then this part stuck out to me because in my mind at the time, I'm thinking, okay, it's pretty clear that these leaders know what the deal is. And we have the AU chair stepping out there, making a request. And it was something that I just could not avoid writing about. But once again, I would not have been able to do that had I not had that Pan-African consciousness, and had I not been cognizant about what has been going on between Zimbabwe and the Western powers since before 1980, and especially after 1980. All right, of the examples, let's go to the right real quick. We got the Blackest Back Coalition. They had a march here before the midterm races. This was back in November. Omali Yeshiteli, Chairman Omali Yeshiteli, was in front of Sankofa Video Books and Cafe. And I had a chance to go up there, interview him briefly and listen to his press conference. That was a good story. Just really given the fact that, again, it gave me a chance to document what the FBI was doing in terms of in terms of encroaching on the freedoms, the humanity, the human rights of African people living in the United States. And once again, initiating proxy wars and using Black people as puppets in their war against Russia. And once again, trying to make Russia the boogeyman when in fact the FBI and the CIA has committed equal, if not worse, atrocities against Black people. So once again, this story was an opportunity to do just that. And it was also an opportunity to draw parallels between the present day and between the mid 20th century, which is always a very good opportunity. The story to the left is very near and dear to my heart, given the fact that days after it was published, I was able to actually participate in these activities with Roots Public Charter School, with the Black Star Action Network International, and with the UNIA RC 2020, as well as the Pan-African Federalist Movement. So, this story, we got global. I interviewed a brother from Sierra Leone, Chief Fode Mansoura, and I also interviewed Mama Bernita, the founder and the principal of Roots Public Charter School. So we got quite diasporic, and we covered a story that would have not been covered otherwise in any other publication. And we covered it with a Pan-African consciousness, talking about the inception of the campaign and talking about why it was important that this happened in the grassroots and not under the auspices of a government, a colonial government at that. All right, two more. Transparency at the base of a contentious ANC election. Shout out to my DC folks, those of y'all who have seen what's been happening over the last 20 years in terms of the plan, AKA gentrification. If you live uptown in DC, then you definitely see. There's a brother in Petworth, a brother who I met at a Paul Robeson event back in April. He lost his ANC seat, but part of the reason why he lost was because of the consolidation of political power around his white colleagues on the ANC. So for those who are not aware, ANC commissioners are neighborhood politicians, those who are elected to pretty much represent 2,000 of their neighbors and to pretty much help them, in matters of trash collection, building permits, traffic safety, public safety, things like that. And this brother who lost in November, he was always adamant about making sure that his white colleagues and even his Black colleagues who had turned against him, he was very adamant about making sure that they were transparent about the deals that they were making. And these were deals that had the potential to make Petworth, uptown DC, even whiter, because, when there's no light in journalism, oftentimes unjust things get done. They get done at the hands of those who have stolen power and acquired power through nefarious means. So oftentimes as a journalist, given my reputation, people come to me with stories and I do my part in interviewing them and investigating and talking to the other side and picking up documentation and putting together a real research piece that outlines the series of events that led to a particular trend. This trend being white people moving into Black neighborhoods, taking power slowly but surely, and after they take power, further whitening the neighborhood and changing the culture. And all of this happened through an ANC election. And I, as a journalist, once again, you step into a space, you see an event, you see a trend, and depending on your worldview, you report it a certain way. And once again, had I not had that Pan-African worldview, I would not have been able to take on this story and give it the justice that it needed. To the right on the screen, we have a story about Black teen and chess phenom, Miles Kwasi Davis. This story, once again, highlighted my Pan-African consciousness in the sense that we talked about how Black youth, African youth in Prince George's County, Maryland, were left out of national chess competitions because of racial hoarding of power by chess officials in Maryland. And Miles Kwasi Davis by virtue of rising through the ranks and acquiring his licensure as a chess tournament holder, was able to ensure that Black youth could participate in chess tournaments. So once again, as was seen in the inverted pyramid, you highlight a person's story at the very top, and then you provide context. So as you can see here in both of these stories, I told one person's story at the top, and then I provided that context about why it was important. In terms of the story to the left, the erasure of Black Petworth through nefarious means was important. And in terms of Miles Kwasi Davis, the Maryland chess tournament officials' hoarding of power as well was very important. And it told us why we needed to tell Miles' story. In this next part of my presentation, I want to talk about a movement that's very near and dear to my heart, the All Eyes on DC movement. For those of y'all who were there to see it in person between 2015 and 2020, All Eyes on DC provided grassroots media. Grassroots meaning that we were in the streets, we were in the neighborhoods, at venues where people commune, and we talked about the real issues before an audience. It wasn't in a sanitized studio where you had to look a certain way or dress a certain way. It was in the studio where we were with mamas and babas, where we said our ashes, our goals, and our amaze, and we had people, including Baba Anthony Browder, on the program to talk about what they were doing. We actually had Baba Anthony Browder in 2019 for the 30th anniversary of the Browder Files, one of the best programs that I had, if I must say so myself. So I want to say a part of this quote right here. Followers of the All Eyes on DC movement, this is the second paragraph in this quote. Followers of the All Eyes on DC movement have seen the personal sides of my journalism, learning that just like them, I don't have all the answers to the problems we face as a worldwide African community. However, I'm able to spark further discussion and action. And you can find this between pages 88 and 89 in Babylon Be Still. So this quote is very important in the sense that journalism, as is often the case in a capitalist society, journalism has become an industry of personalities and an industry of fluff. So the journalistic personality is often ego-driven, and people in the journalism industry consider themselves as gods. This is not a blanket statement. This is something that I'm telling you guys from my experiences. So being a grassroots journalist, it entails that you see yourself among the people in the sense that you have to approach them and you have to respect their humanity. Journalists are flies on the wall. We are not the stars, but we are flies on the wall with the job of bringing to the light the experiences of those who want their story told and those whose stories can highlight trends and things that are happening in society. And the All Eyes on DC show was a very good venue that allowed me to do that. Moving on. Important elements of the All Eyes on DC model. We have 4 here. We include the audience in the story. We don't just talk at them. We center community figures, regardless of prominence or fame. We create griot-like spaces for discussion and learning. And last but not least, we center Mama Africa in the discussion. When I initially made All Eyes on DC, the idea was that it was to bridge the gap, and it was reflective of my experiences going to the George Washington University and being a native Washingtonian among a lot of people, Black, white, otherwise, who had never seen the real DC. And initially, the goal was to bridge the gap between Washington being downtown, the State Department of Soul, bridge the gap between Washington and DC, Chocolate City. But, I dived into my consciousness, and I came to recognize DC as the epicenter of the global Babylon system, in the sense that through the accumulation of power over the last century, the United States has been able to keep a pulse on everything that is happening to us and have been able to control us. And DC is a very important center of a movement for self-determination. And because DC is still a colony in every sense of the word, it is incumbent upon Black people to understand their situation and to do something about it, which is why a grassroots journalist has to act as a vehicle for self-determination. The last part of the presentation tonight, and before I move on, I'm just very esteemed to be in the space once again. I've talked to you guys about what grassroots journalism is. I've shown you guys the status quo. I've shown y'all examples of articles that I've written. I've shown y'all the inverted pyramid. And now I want to get into the tools for development as a reporter. So first of all, African consciousness is the foundation. And I have here our esteemed ancestor, John Henry Clark, an autodidactic ancestor, one who taught himself. But the point that I'm making here is that you have to have that African consciousness before you go into any industry, because by the end of the day, the goal is to nation build. Nation building meaning that you do for self, you create industries, you create institutions, you create things that are of benefit to our people, but you do that with an African consciousness. This excerpt comes from one of my articles inside Babylon Be Still that deals with education. And I'm going to read part of it. Black students and other students in American schools, for that matter, must be exposed to African-centered historical and contemporary texts that affirm their African heritage and alert them to the true nature of Black people's relationship with the United States and other duplicitous Western powers. So this is a concept that the United States, you know, being as schizophrenic as it is as a nation, has caught on in the COVID era. We have critical race theory. We have, even as close as Virginia, Governor Northam looking at the curriculum and trying to change it, take out certain things. But the fact remains that we have to build institutions that foster African consciousness, and we have those institutions. But an African consciousness is what a journalist needs in order to stay true to the grassroots and produce news of substance to people. Here are the traits. Once again, a strong Pan-African foundation. You need strong listening skills and storytelling abilities. You also need to use imagery in your stories. This is very important in your lead. When you're describing somebody's experience, you use the lead and you use imagery to paint a picture of their experience, because people will understand trends and greater societal ideas through people's individual stories, which is why as a journalist, you do your best to conduct your research, gather your data, and make a determination about who or what would prove to be the most important element of the story, and you keep that toward the very top. You prioritize the voices of the underrepresented, and you also fact check. You gather variant perspectives, you research and you cite sources. This is very important in this day and age. Even with social media and us breaking down the walls, we are still scholars. You cannot stray away from citing your sources, and you can't stray away from gathering perspectives. It does not mean that you are perpetuating the lies being told to hold us down. It is that you are addressing them and you are taking account of them. It makes you a stronger scholar, because anybody reading it cannot question your credibility if you have given credence, not given credence, but if you have at least acknowledged what the other side is saying. You acknowledge what the other side is saying, And in the cases of argumentative writing and essays, you can even strike it down. But the idea is that you have to be a scholar and a researcher as you advance your cause under the banner of grassroots journalism. With that, I'll open the floor for questions or reflections. I have to say it again, I'm very grateful. This presentation was a year in the making. So I really want to build with y'all. Any questions y'all have, please feel free to spew them out. Sante Sana.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. And as we begin to have the second part of our discussion, we do ask that you place any questions for Baba Sam in the Q&A box, and I will take your questions from there. I do want to just start off by saying, Bob, your presentation is a wonderful presentation. The work that you do is so important. It reminds me of that proverb, that saying, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So let me just start off by saying thank you for being a lion for our people and telling our side of the story and bringing in our worldview, our perspective, and centering us in those various discussions and stories. So we definitely appreciate that. What you shared is definitely important in relation to, there was a point you made in a video that it's about Africa and how they're taking hold of Pan-African ideals to really control us. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
No doubt. So during the U.S. Africa Leader Summit, Joe Biden, the president of the United States, revealed an initiative. The initiative, the name escapes me, but it has the words Africa and diaspora in it. And this is pretty much an effort to allocate resources and money. We're talking about 55 billion over the next 3 years to establish relationships between the United States and the African continent, and to build that diasporic relationship. As a matter of fact, at the summit, there was a woman, a Ghanaian woman, as a matter of fact, who is building a factory here in Ward 7, and she is going to take products from the continent, bring it here to the factory to process them. And in doing that, this arrangement will help African women in Ghana who are producing, shea butter and other products. The Biden administration, they are financing these operations under the guise of Pan-Africanism. And as they continue to do that, Pan-Africanism is in danger of losing its grassroots anti-establishment flavor. Because at the time that the concept originated, and when I say Pan-Africanism, I'm really talking about universal African nationalism. At the time of its inception, Africa, for the most part, was still colonized. So we were talking about governments that were not ran by us or for us. So for the United States government to take the word Pan-Africanism, it is an attempt for them to dilute its meaning and to bring in people, some of whom are well-meaning, to bring them in and to finance their aspirations, but to at the same time be in control, because whoever pays the piper plays the tune. The United States, by financing Pan-Africanism, has nefarious intentions, in the sense that, once again, they want to make sure that they have a hold on the continent. They don't want Russia or China to have a hold on the continent. They see what Russia and China is doing. The United States, they did their part pretty much in creating Afrikan. They destabilized Liberia. They killed Patrice Lumumba. They pretty much turned Libya into a cesspool. They've done everything over the last few decades and even more to destabilize Africa. Now they want to come in under the guise of Pan-Africanism to maintain a softer form of control, where they have people who look like us at the forefront, to make it look like it is us who are making these decisions. And I said this earlier on Facebook under my Rise Ploquia account. During the rise of Pan-African consciousness about 10 years ago, let's say 2015 or so, with the release of the documentary Hidden Colors and with the rise of Pan-African personalities, the word Hotep got thrown around derogatorily. The same people who are saying, who called us Hoteps, they are buying plane tickets to go to the Black Star Festival, to go to Afrochella. They're buying up property on the African continent. These are people who have melanin just like me and you, but they don't understand the foundational grassroots aspects of Pan-Africanism or of universal African nationalism and why it was conceived in the very first place. They are going to be there, and without that consciousness, they will perpetuate the class warfare that was brought on by neocolonialism. And they will do it at the beck and call of the United States government that co-ops Pan-Africanism. Anything that the government funds or creates through an initiative is meant to keep us in further bondage. But they do it through proxy. That proxy being well-meaning, in some cases, well-meaning Africans who want to change the world, but don't have the appropriate infrastructure in place to do it in the grassroots.
Awesome, thank you. And Tendai Johnson also backs up that comment about you highlighting our voices, and just want to also commend you for doing that. So along those lines, does objectivity exist in the journalism industry? How can you maintain objectivity in this industry if people harbor bias? So a twofold question.
Very good question. I alluded to it earlier. Objectivity does not exist in journalism. By nature of our personality, we carry biases with us into the newsroom. That's the reason why the Black press was founded in the very first place. John B. Russworm, Sam Cornish, right? Frederick Douglass, Ada B. Wells. They produced newspapers, they produced outlets to create a perspective, because at the time, Europeans, white people who were producing newspapers, they came with a bias in which they saw us as subhuman, and they used that bias to advance causes that legitimized our lynchings. Ida B. Wells, one of the ancestors who are holding high regard, she did a lot of work in Memphis. She was actually ran out of Memphis because she understood, she overstood that objectivity did not exist in journalism. She saw that the lack of objectivity in journalism allowed white women to lie on Black men after they, to lie on Black men, pretty much. She talked about that. She gave context. She provided context about the mass lynchings that took place during the Reconstruction era. And she did that with an understanding that objectivity does not exist. If you are a human being with unique experiences and a unique worldview, you harbor biases, but you have to, you can acknowledge those biases, you can acknowledge them, but like I said earlier, you give yourself credibility when you acknowledge the other side, when you give the other side an opportunity to speak, when you produce facts. And the key word for a journalist, any journalism student, the key word is attribution. Attribution, ATTRIBUTION. That means anything you say in a news article can be attributed to a source. So as a journalist, I never say anything. Somebody else said that. I cite my sources. You understand? If I say that somebody's corrupt, I didn't say it. Somebody else said that to me. Or if they are corrupt, I don't say it, I show it. I produce the facts. I document what they have done. I document what others have said about them. That, by the end of the day, protects me and my credibility. I am an information teller, and I fashioned it in a way where people are able to draw their own conclusions. But I've done so after acknowledging my worldview and the experiences that brought me there.
Awesome. Now the next several questions, revolve around our youth. And I'm going to ask them in this order. I'm just looking to see the best way to put these together. An anonymous attendee said, Baba Sam, thank you for your presentation and your work. It's essential that we have Black journalists like yourself to report from our people's perspective. How can we get our youth to study journalism? You remind me of a young Umia Abu Jamal. And align with that, if you can tie in this question, how does the decline in reading and writing among youth affect the future of journalism? So we'll start with those two.
All right, no
Let
doubt.
me know if you need me to repeat.
No doubt. So I can answer both of those in one full swoop. You have to instill the love of reading in your children from a very young age. In addition to that, you have to communicate with your children as if they're adults, not with adult themes, but speaking with them in complete sentences and asking them open-ended questions. You do that in order to ensure that they're always in the mode where they are analyzing the world around them and they are self-aware. Because if once they do that from a very young age, they will not be afraid to express themselves. In regards to the journalism piece, once again, you have to read to your children, right? You have two different stages. You have two different stages of reading. First, you have comprehension, and then you have analysis. The comprehension piece is where a lot of our people get stuck at because they're not reading as much as they need to. The reading fluency and the reading fluency is where our young people are stuck at. Because, and once again, I'm not making blanket statements. I'm just speaking on what I've seen. You know, they lack the stamina that previous generations had. You know, being able to sit down for minutes at a time to read a text 2 or 3 times, to pick the words apart, to decipher what's being said. They lack that, and that's not their fault. We're talking about this right here. This has been a weapon of mass destruction when it comes to our youth. I've seen parents. I've been to shows at UDC, for example. I forget the name of the program. It comes on every fall, September or so. Beautiful African gear, beautiful dance numbers, drumming, all of that. I've seen youth as young as 3 years old playing on their phone in the front seats while all of that is going on. You mean to tell me that with all of that going on, with the potential for their senses to be fed, somebody gave their child a phone to distract them from all of that, when they could have been taking in the sounds and the sights in order to articulate on their own later on what was going on. That is what's going on. The technology, the video games, the phones are dumbing down our children. And these are products that even the creators would not let their children use. Steve Jobs, before he transitioned, said that he would not let his children touch Apple products. And he knew that what Apple products would do, which is why we have to get back to old school values in which young people are reading in front of us, where they are not only reading in front of us, but they're comprehending in full sentences about characters, about setting, about the conflict, about the plot itself. What happened first? What happened second? What do you think is going to happen next? Right? What's this character? Why is this character like that? Describe this character. No. Don't use the words that you saw. Use your own words. You got to build communication from the very start. It doesn't happen overnight. The first 7 years of a child's life are very critical. After year 7, it's over. Not over necessarily, because anybody can be redeemed, but after year 7, it gets harder. So what are you doing to build that child's vocabulary, to strengthen their reading fluency, to make sure that they can stand still? Because I'm tired of people telling me that the reading is too boring, that the child is not engaged. Teachers have the hardest job because they expect you, and I'll stop here. I actually blame Lean on Me for this conundrum. Lean on Me gave people the idea that teachers can be the end all be all, that we can be that we could teach, we can be social workers, we can be entertainers. It don't work like that. When it comes to reading, you have to have a certain type of discipline in order to overcome difficulties. The writing process is very difficult. The reading process is difficult, especially when you're reading closely. So to wrap it all up, you got to instill that love of reading from a very young age. And you do that by knowing your child and seeking out their interests. And you pick up things that align with their interests. If they like sports, get them sports biographies. If they like animals, take them to a zoo and have them read the information about the zoo animals. If they like space, take them to a space museum, build their vocabulary, talk to them about the news, engage your child in discussion. Do not yell commands at your children. Ask them open-ended questions. I'll stop there.
Now, as an educator, I'm over here just clapping my hands, building that background knowledge, that vocabulary to build a comprehension. I am totally there with you. I couldn't agree more with what you just shared about the importance of building literacy skills in our children from birth, like you said, speaking to them, using those vocabulary words, and making it a part of just their everyday life. Thank you for sharing that. And along those lines with the youth, you mentioned the cell phone, and we have a question here regarding technology. And the question is, are you familiar with ChatGPT, the AI bot that students use to write their essays? Or I guess they can use it to write essays. What are your thoughts about this technology and its potential impact on journalism?
Very familiar with it. It reminds me of what we had when I was coming up. We had, for those of us who took the language classes like Spanish and French, we had the online translators. If you were lazy and you didn't feel like writing, stuff from memory, you would just translate from English to Spanish. So that sort of reminds me of that. But I'm quite familiar with that. I'm quite familiar with GPT. As a matter of fact, it's giving college professors hell right now. I'm hearing more and more about it every day. And what I will say is that if not used now with anything else, there can be some use for it as a teaching tool. So if I was in a position where a student used ChatGPT and they try to pass it off as their own work, I would print out what they sent me and I would print out another version that was better, and I would show them where the software faltered. Because as of right now, the software is not where it's going to be at if it's going to take over journalism. As a matter of fact, from my understanding, the software gets smarter and smarter every day by picking up certain language cues, patterns, things of that nature. But AI is going to be here for a long time. With everything I just said, I think the danger is that with our youth, especially Gen Z, already being immersed in the technology, there are certain things that they're going to lose when it comes to the skill of writing. And among that are certain technicalities and certain tricks of the trade. For example, transitional phrases that take you from one sentence to another. And even beyond that, the wordplay that we saw in, Richard Wright's writing, that we saw in Langston Hughes's writing, that we saw in Zora Neale Hurston's writing. There's certain wordplay that you can't learn using AI. You got to read it for yourself, and then you write and write and write until you found your voice. Children are not going to have that if they keep depending on the technology. The technology is, in a sense, taking their brain out of their bodies and putting it in something else, and they're becoming more dependent on it. And it makes me think about what's going to happen in the event that all of this just shuts down. Everything that they've depended on, they can't do anymore because they were dependent on that technology to be a facilitator. So that's the danger in it. But like I said before, how we meet that challenge is in one, exposing them to writing and reading and talking at a very young age. And two, putting up what the GPT did next to what an experienced writer did to show them the key differences. And three, in the writing instruction, continue to stress the small fundamental things, capitalizing the first word, the first letter, and the first word in your sentences, capitalizing the letter I when you're talking about yourself, proper punctuation, correctly spelling your homophones or your homonyms, there versus there versus there. There are certain things that children continue to overlook because of what technology has done. But I would say addressing it in those ways.
Awesome. Yes, awesome. And just want to let the audience know to please make sure you come out next month, February, let me get the date, the third Wednesday, February 15th, we will have Dr. Coco Raytheon presenting on AI. So we will be continuing this discussion around AI. It's definitely an important topic. And as you were talking about AI taking over certain skills that we have, it made me think about my ability to remember numbers. There are certain numbers that I have stored in my memory and they're stored in my memory because I knew them before I got the cell phone. But once I got a cell phone, if I put your number on my cell phone, I don't know your number. There are people whose numbers I really should know, and I don't know. So I do say I have to start forcing myself to actually dial numbers again to memorize them. So it does show me at least the potential effects of ChatGPT being used by students for writing and them not honing in on their own individual writing skills. So keeping along those lines though of technology, can you talk about the benefits and drawbacks of using social media as a journalistic tool?
No doubt. Let's start with the drawbacks. First of all, social media has made it where people, because we live in such a high-paced society, many of our people do not vet their sources. And many of our people are caught up in personality rather than skill. So you have people who are dynamic speakers, people who tout their prowess for not being in the so-called mainstream educational system, who spew inaccuracies. I'm not talking about any particular person. This is a trend that I've been seeing over the years. With the open democracy, as it is called, that is social media and that is YouTube, anybody, anywhere is able to produce any kind of video content or social media content. And we saw this in the case involving Megan Thee Stallion and Tory Lanez. Regardless of how you feel about Megan Thee Stallion's music, it's very clear that people had a certain bias against her, and they used that to spread misinformation about the case from the very moment that Tory Lanez shot her up until the time that the verdict was read. Because of that bias, a lot of misinformation was spread. Initially, people questioned whether she got shot. This was despite the fact that she entered the hospital and medical records showed that she was shot. And then later on, there was speculation about who shot her, even though there was evidence presented in court that Tory Lanez, in fact, admitted to it on the phone when speaking to her friend. Another aspect of that case that I want to bring up is what the bloggers did. The bloggers, they said a not guilty verdict at the very point when the jury was still deliberating. So you have people on Twitter, on Facebook with no media literacy. They're following any and everybody who calls himself a journalist, and they're taking what they're saying as gospel, because in the age of social media, everybody is correct and everybody has an opinion. So because they have an opinion, they're correct and they don't have to hold themselves accountable. And with the Wild Wild West, as it is called, anybody is able to just spread misinformation. And our people, when I say our people, I mean our Pan-African people, are in danger in all of this, because you have people out there who are taking advantage, right? They're taking advantage of our thirst for knowledge, of our thirst for relevancy, of our thirst to get back to pre-colonial times. So even with that, they will produce they will produce videos and memes that are inaccurate about who we are as a people. Despite the spirit of the meme, people who are well-meaning and who want to dig deeper into their history, they will take it as fact. This is indicative. One prime example of that is the anything but African movement. So, instead of, people don't want to be called Africans anymore. They want to be called, indigenous. They want to be called Hebrew Israelites, so forth and so on. I have no issue with that. I do think that in terms of the Hebrew Israelite and the indigenous things, there's some nuance to that sort of, validates that perspective. If you are somebody of the Rastafari liberty, or you are somebody who, read Ivan Van Sertima's book, and about, just us traveling the world before Columbus got here, of course. But at the very same time, you have people who can take tidbits of information, embellish it, and make it their own and pass it off as valid information. And those of us with no literacy skills, we go to social media and we spread it like wildfire. And those of us who are in the most danger in all of this are young people who have yet to understand what fake news is versus real news. Now, with all of that being said, social media has the potential, I would say, of getting the news to the people the fastest. So instead of at one point in time, you had the 3 so-called major news networks, they were able to broadcast something. But now, you and I with our phones, we could be at the scene of a crime and we can just post it up. That's pretty much how the family of George Floyd was able to get their just due, because that horrific event was put on video. As a matter of fact, with all of us being tired about video, I would say the one redeeming quality about video is that the video actually made real or realer what it was that we knew all along. So that is one redeeming quality about social media. At the very same time, we need to take into account that a lot of our people do not have media literacy. So people are quick to post things without fact checking, and people are just even quicker to repost it, thinking that it's accurate, and it is making our people dumber and dumber. That's where I'll stop.
Okay. Speaking on media literacy, a question that just popped in my head is, how do we build media literacy in our people? And definitely this program and the work that you're doing is one of those ways. And it also brought up the question, is a journalism degree required to practice journalism? So along those lines, what are your thoughts about going to school for journalism? Is it necessary?
I think to a degree it is. I think, there are examples of people who haven't done it and they still flourished in the industry. I think that journalism itself is a trade that needs to be learned. If you do go to college for it, at the very least, take it as a minor and take a few courses. Journalism teaches you to write clearly. As a journalist, you got to balance. There's a balance that you got to maintain in how you convey information. So it's about conveying information so that you get all the details correct and you're accurate, but at the very same time, it comes across as clearly as possible to somebody who's in the 8th grade. Now, sometimes you might get a bit, passionate, so you might say a big word here or there. But journalistic writing is about maintaining that balance, which is why I highly encourage people, to take journalism classes. Get a minor if you enter college. But I think the best experience is actually writing for a newspaper under the tutelage of an experienced editor. That's where I got a lot of my experience. That's where I got my best writing done. So between 2012 and 2014, that's where I grew exponentially in my writing. But J School gave me that foundation, which is why I would suggest that, you do get some training, if not in school, then under a reporter. And in addition to that, I would encourage people to read articles, see the style of writing, see where people put voices, see the type of lingo that is being used in articles, because it's very consistent, from them saying he said, she said, allegedly, things like that.
Great. And to wrap up tonight's discussion, you're speaking about journalism being under the tutelage of a journalist. Want to close out with the final question of the evening. Who are your favorite journalists, past and present, and why? And that'll be our final question. Who are your favorite journalists, past and present, and why?
No doubt. Present day, I got to give a shout out to Barrington Salmon. He edited my book, but most importantly, he was of great help to me when I first came to the Informer. I was a student of the late, great Denise W. Barnes, not Denise Rolock Barnes. Denise Rolock Barnes is the publisher, and she is alive and well. But there was another Denise named Denise W. Barnes, who was my editor. And Barrington was her colleague at the Washington Times, who came over to the Washington Informer. And when he was there, I was there as a young up-and-coming journalist, and I had a chance to read his writing. And I also had a chance to accompany him on reporting assignments during Obama's inauguration, Howard's commencement. And just his prowess and the way that he is able to break down historical events, geopolitical events, things of that nature. Very, very good journalist. I also have, as far as journalists, Gil Noble, as it is. Ada B. Wells, of course, John B. Russworm, by virtue of him, repatriating to Mama Liberia, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, the Negro World, and that was a global paper. You had people, when it touched down on the continent, people ran to the shores and they brought it back, There's a whole lot more, I gotta give a, shout out to Brother Omawale, as far as, his analysis, if you don't know about this brother, please check him out, very analytical. His commentary on events, he pulls everything to make a point. It's very succinct, very beautiful, I would say. Tiffany Cross, she has Democratic leanings in a sense, but I appreciate what she did at MSNBC, and I wish that our sisters and our brothers would learn that MSNBC has no love for you after being Black is no longer in vogue. Before I wrap up, I am going to address freelance journalism briefly. Freelance journalism, I would highly suggest to anybody. I recently just got on contract for the Informer as a full-time reporter, and that was after years of being a freelance reporter. And freelance reporting, that was my choice, just because it allowed me to be more flexible. But the Informer has been my home, so I decided to join the home team. But freelance journalism really allows you to get your name out there and build up your bylines. And I would say, I would highly encourage anybody who wants to be a journalist to write for reputable organizations. Have your own material, of course, but don't stray away from learning from people who've been in the industry, because that's how you sharpen your writing. If you have, an outlet that you're writing for, and you got that outlet as your banner, as you're out and about, you're likelier to get more of a people with less of an attitude who would be more enthusiastic about talking to you. All Eyes on DC flourished because a lot of my first people who I featured were people who I met while freelancing for the Informer. So I highly encourage freelancing. You do it. Make sure you learn from real journalists, and make sure that, we got to stay true to the tenets of the industry, because people in this day and age, People are too proud of being dumb. People are too proud of saying, well, I didn't do this, I didn't go to school for that. There's nothing wrong with getting a skill set and learning under people. It's how they did it in Kemet. School in Kemet, from what I recall, was like 40 years. It's the same thing in journalism. I'm like 14 years in, you know, nearly half, not half my life. I'm getting up there, kinda. I'm still young, but I would say about about 40% of my life. Yeah, about 40% of my life doing journalism. So, and I still got a ways to go, but that's only because I just got into like junior vet status. And that was after learning and freelancing and getting edited and re-edited and actually getting a foothold in the industry. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and speaking on such an important topic as journalism and telling our story. I know I haven't heard too many people speak on the topic of the specific role of journalists. We often hear how it's important to tell our stories, and I've usually heard it told via a historical perspective. So it was really, really enlightening to hear the journalistic perspective tonight. And if you look in the chat, a lot of people really enjoyed tonight's presentation. And I want to let everyone know you will be able to watch this again on our YouTube channel, IKG Cultural Resource Center YouTube's page. This video will be posted within a couple of days. I would like to also invite you all out to our next Wisdom Wednesday presentation, which will be on February 15th, featuring Dr. Coco Rassillon giving a discussion on AI. And with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Again, we're wishing you a wonderful 2023, and we will see you next month. Peace.